is Michelle Acker, and I am the Vice President of SNEA. I will be serving as a facilitator for tonight's session, and I will be monitoring the chat box throughout. My co-host tonight is Carla Sinabria, and she is also part of SNEA's officers. Before we continue, I would like to go over a few housekeeping rules. Please keep your mic muted unless asked otherwise. Type all your questions that you have into the chat box, and there will be time during the presentation or afterwards where we can answer the questions. Today's presentation will be led by Amy Joviditis from the CMC at UCF. Without further ado, the School of Teacher Education and Student National Education Association presents Lexile More Than Just a Number.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Michelle and Carla, for allowing me to come and visit and talk with you all today. I had fun last week. I'm trying to get all this Zoom stuff down, so hopefully tonight it'll be a little smoother than last time. But for those of you who I have not had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Amy. As Michelle said, I'm the librarian here at the Curriculum Materials Center. It's actually, January will be 3 years for me. And prior to that, I was a science teacher and a school library media specialist for about 20 years and became very, I was a media specialist when Lexile went into effect. So I've got to see the birth of it, how it affected Media Center, how it was introduced to a classroom, saw it develop over several years. And I got to see it last. And if you stay in education long enough, you'll see a lot of things come and go. And Lexile is here to stay. So thank you for joining us tonight and talking about Lexile More Than Just a Number. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have no what's the word I'm looking for? Sound tonight, so that shouldn't be a problem. No volume. All right. So there we go. So our learning targets tonight are to give you a definition about what is Lexile, the difference between a reader and a text Lexile, talking about the different Lexile codes because there's a ton of them, and then how you can use it as an educational tool, and a few cautionary tales as well. In order to go any further, we need to have some groundwork and discuss about what exactly is Lexile. Lexile came out through a company, well, if you go to lexile.com, everything I'm talking with you tonight and the website will be on a few of the slides coming up, was created by Metametrics, and they developed this incredibly intricate software program through which they used a numeric scale, and the numeric scale was used in two ways. One, it assesses the student's readability, and two, it assesses a text's complexity. And by applying the same scale to both of those measurements, reading a student's level to read and how difficult a book is to read, you were able to come out with something called a Lexile measure and identify what the so-called sweet spot is. So where a student should be reading in order to comprehend enough of the book to truly get the true meaning of the book. And Lexile is also a great progress monitoring tool, which of course we'll talk about. When it comes to what the goal is for Lexile, it says if we know how well a student can read and how hard a specific book is to comprehend, you can predict how likely that student is to understand that book. Ideally, in order to comprehend a book, Lexile and Metametrics is saying that a student should understand 75% of that book from beginning to end. If they can successfully comprehend 75% of what they've read, that's what they're shooting for. Now, when I first started, when I saw Lexile first come out, it was through Scholastic Reading Inventory, and that is on there somewhere on the bottom left-hand corner. Since then, many other venues, platforms, software, benchmark systems, national assessment tools, state assessment tools have come into play. And here in Orange and Seminole County, KnightED is the primary tool used to define what a student's Lexile measure is. In Seminole County, which I'm most aware of, in Orange County, the Reading KnightED assessment is given 3 times a year, once in the beginning, once around winter break, and then once before they leave in spring. And when that reading assessment is done, the student gets a Lexile measure. This is a printout from Lexile.com that shows you a little bit about what the actual results are that a teacher would see when they're monitoring a student's progress and assessing Lexile and Lexile scale. And as teachers, you're going to find out green's good, red's bad. And this shows you for these particular students, this is 5th grade. And the students that are in the green area of the scale are doing well on their iReady reading diagnostic. The students on the red end of that scale are doing, they need some further, intervention. And if you look over where B is, that column B, it is telling you once they finished that iReady assessment, that reading diagnostic, it is giving the students Lexile measure. And you can see at the top, there's a 1210 Lexile, all the way to the bottom of that column is a 645 Lexile. Next to that, it's giving you a percentage. So when you're comparing it to the peers in their grade level, that's where that student falls. So the student who's at a 1210 is 93% when compared with their peers at that grade level, and the student at the very bottom at the 645 is at 41% when compared with their peers. And then if it's tracked, if it's done 3 progress monitorings, you can see the different percentages as the test progresses and you get more tests added in. When you look at a Lexile, after taking the iReady diagnostic, the student is given a Lexile measure, and it will be written as a number on that very top. It will say like 770L, where the L stands for the Lexile. And the thing to remember in general, you'll find out there's an exception, the higher the number, the higher the student's reading level. So a 250L would be a low Lexile compared to a 770L. A student's Lexile will only go up in intervals of 5, so 5, 10, 15, 20. The highest possible is a 2000. I know when I was in elementary school and the Lexile assessments were done, in 5th grade, 4th grade, very often I would have a 1200, a 1300, somewhere a student would be falling into that range. Anything below a 5L is no longer really given a number. It's assigned a BR and a beginning reader Lexile, and we'll talk about that. This is a thing everybody wants to see, and this chart, honestly, I've seen over the years change multiple times, but over the years, as they obtain more data and are able to assess more parameters and more students, they're able to refine this. And even since I did this last year, this is a new chart. And Lexile Metametrics, they took assessments of samples of 3 million students. So that's a pretty big chunk when you're looking at data. And they measured it over 6 years, from 2010 to 2016. So by grade level, they're looking at the beginning of the year in the fall and the end of the year. It's divided by grade level, and it's also giving you what the 50th percentile would be and what the 90th percentile. So let's just go to grade level 2 as an example right here. For grade level 2, if you were at the 50th percentile, you'd be about a 290. At the 90th percentile, a 675. And that's pretty high for 2nd grade. At the end of the year, they always want to see growth. And that's one of the most important things as you do the iReady diagnostics from the beginning of the year to right around winter to the spring. That is really the essential thing. They want to see growth. So the end of the year spring for 2nd grade, the 50th percentile would be at 425 compared to the 290. And the 90th percentile would be at the 795 to the 675. Not as much growth at the higher end as there is in the lower end. So as I'm saying, growth is really what they want to see. And a lot of schools, I know in the school I was in before I came here, the students had their data notebooks. And every time they took an iReady diagnostic, they had to chart their own data. And when the parents would come in, they would show them their iReady Lexile measures and their math scores, and they charted it. And that was the most important thing that you want to see with a student. You want to see continual growth. And that growth is really a lot of what Metametrics and Lexile is based on. and that growth is predicted over a curve. Now, the diagram on the left, that is the points for a particular student. The diagram on the right would be the national comparison. So the teachers, and actually this particular growth planner up here in the left-hand corner, and I've got the website down below, this is on Lexile.com, and Lexile.com is where a lot of this information has come from, and educators, parents, everybody can go to and use. There's a free version, and then you can pay and get more access to more detailed items. But this is something a parent can use. This is something an educator can use. This is a free access tool at Lexile.com where you can plug in your child's or your student's Lexiles, and you can see the charted path. Ideally, on the left-hand side, that green path is the chart we want, because as you can see, the bottom x-axis goes from the grade level. Ideally, the goal is to get every student college text ready, career readability ready, and they assess that at about a 1300. So from the beginning to the end of 12th grade, what they're trying to do is to set a trajectory for that student to end up at about a 1300 Lexile, so that when they reach college, they can read those textbooks that you all are reading, which are very, very complicated. So on the left, the student is charting below and is making up for it if they keep going on the trajectory. And on the right, it's telling you in the blue that they're in the 25th percentile, definitely lower than they need to be. That was just some points I plugged in for this presentation. But this growth projector is definitely a great tool, and it is free. So even if you have students that you are student teaching, you could plug the data in and see where they're at. And even parents can do this with their children. And that really is one of the main goals, college ahead. And if you look down in the bottom right-hand corner, it says research indicates that material students with their first encounter in college and careers are around the 1300 Lexile. As all of this data has been compiled by Metametrics, what they're trying to do is to chart that course so that student at the end of high school can jump into college and read the texts. So as you see a lot of these scales, that is the goal. That is what these scales are set for, and what they're trying to chart the trajectory, get those students on the right path so that they can be successful when they reach college. All right, so we see how a student gets assigned a Lexile through one of those inventory processes, through iReady, through Scholastic Reading Counts, through all of those different programs nationwide. But a book also has to be assigned a Lexile, and because you want to be able to compare those as apples to apples, the student's readability and the text difficulty. So what they've done is they have created a software program that they input the text, and it's analyzed, and at the end of that after it's analyzed, it's assigned a Lexile as well. So just like a student can get a 600L as a Lexile, a book can get a 600L as a Lexile. One of the differences between Lexiles being assigned for students and books is that a student's Lexile will only go up increments of 5, 10, 15, 20, where a book's Lexile will only go up in increments of 10, with a 10L being the lowest. Okay, I'm just making sure I have everything on there. Okay. Now, how do they assess how difficult a book is? When they plug all those words into that computer program and it spits out a number, what are the two main things it's looking at? One is word frequency, also known as semantic difficulty, and the other one is sentence length, also as syntactic complexity. So those are the two primary factors that will determine how low or how high in the readability of a book in the Lexile is. So semantic, now I'll show you a picture a little bit further on that shows these different, two different semantic and syntactic plotted. But I put that little phrase in there in italics right off the website because I really want to make sure you understand what all of these words are getting compared to. When you're looking at semantic complexity, they're looking to see how often a word shows up. Because if a student's doing lots of reading and this word is always showing up and they're always seeing it a lot, it's not a difficult thing for them. What makes it difficult is when they're reading and they come across a word they don't see very often. If they're reading books that come across words they don't see very often, it's going to be hard for them to comprehend. So what they did was, read that, is frequency of the word in the corpus of nearly 60 million words that is employed in the Lexile analyzer. So when they take the texts of these books and they put it through this software program, they're looking at the words and they're comparing it to these 60 million words to see how often they pop up. Now, if a word pops up a lot, and a lot of things that kids read, that's not a challenge. It's the words that don't pop up a lot. That's the challenge. And that's what drives a Lexile of a book up semantically. Now, one of the cool things that Lexile has added on recently, and this is one of the tools that you can access, is they've had these word lists, and down below in the left-hand corner, it shows you the address, the website address. So they thought, you know, if we really want these students to go and be college ready, where are the words coming from that we should really be maybe helping them understand? So Lexile, and circled in that red, you see that they went out and they looked at textbooks. And they made word lists that are dependent on these textbooks that reflect what the students will encounter. If this is an example of one of the word lists. This is a general one. They also have math and science specific, excuse me for a minute, word lists. So you can go on to Lexile.com, go to the word lists and get these word lists. Now, up at the top, if you notice, this is a second grade word list, and I was pretty impressed by this. There's a lot of higher order concept words on this page. But so they're saying if you in second grade understand these words, if you can read them and know what they mean, your ability to do well in an iReady test, a diagnostic test, will definitely be helped because these are the words that they're anticipating that you'll have difficulty with. All right, so semantic is how much you see the word. The other determining factor of how high the Lexile of a text will be syntactic complexity. And that's based on, one predictor is the length of the sentence. And another predictor is not only the length of the sentence, but really how many commas are in there. So how many clauses are in there when they stick those commas and then there's stuff in between. And those two things can greatly drive up the Lexile of a sentence and the Lexile of a book. And what they're also saying is the longer the sentence, the longer the student has to track, the harder it is for them to retain what they're reading in their short-term memory. This book, when I was a media specialist and students had to read certain books, and sadly, the school I was at, a lot of times the teachers would require them to read within their Lexile range, and we'll talk about that later on. This is Little House on the Prairie, Christmas in the Big Woods. And the students that had like a 800, 900 Lexile, and they needed to read so many books within their Lexile, that was not my choice. Let me just say that right off. That was teacher's choice. And they needed to read a book within their Lexile. They would run and grab this picture book. And the Lexile of this picture book is 900. And it actually even has an AD in front of it, which we'll talk about, which means adult guided. When you look at that, and it's a picture book, and there's not very many words on these Little House on the Prairie picture books. It's a very short book, very little words, but the Lexile is very high, 900. So let's talk about between that semantic and syntactic, and sorry, this is the biggest I could get it. But I want to draw your attention to these commas. At last, Aunt Eliza, comma, Uncle Peter, comma, and the curious bundled up their coats and blankets and got into the bobsled. Long sentence, lots of commas. And I want to draw you to this one. In a little while, the happy sound of sleigh bells was gone, comma, and Christmas was over. Simple things like those commas and those clauses that are in between drive the Lexile up. And the students loved these books because they were simple to read, but due to the syntactic complexity, the length of the sentence, and those independent clauses, the Lexile was driven much higher, and they could read it because it was in their so-called range, which we'll talk about. Here is a comparison chart just to give you a little idea about Lexile, sentence length, and word frequency. Now keep in mind, word frequency is not how many times a word shows up in that book. It's how many times the word shows up in that 600 million word analyzer, whatever that is that they're getting compared to, how often it shows up. And a couple things to keep in mind. If you look on this one for sentence length, so 11.9 would be a longer sentence and 8.4 would be the shortest sentence. And if you look, the Lexiles correspond. The longer sentence has a higher Lexile. Even though they have the same difficulty of word frequency, their Lexiles here are predicted by the sentence length. And here's examples of some sentences over here from those texts. But this bottom one, The One-Eyed Giant by Mary Pope Osborne, which is a Magic Treehouse book. The Lexile is 680, but this word frequency is a lot of what is driving this Lexile up. Now, the thing to remember that when it comes to sentence length, the higher the number, the higher the average sentence length, the higher the Lexile. And it's exactly the opposite when it comes to word frequency. The lower the number, so the lower, with word frequency, the lower the number, the lesser times the students are actually seeing that word. And because they're seeing it less, they will recognize it less. They have less exposure to it. So it's driving up the difficult level of that text. The lower that word frequency mode is, the higher the Lexile. So you have to think kind of opposite of each other. So sentence length drives it up, and if the word frequency is low, it also drives it up because the students won't have seen the word often at all in their reading repertoire of vocabulary. All right, so you've got these numbers. They've taken their iReady diagnostic. The student has their number. Metametrics has put the books through the Lexile analyzers. The books have their Lexiles. What do we do now? Well, here's where Lexile.com and I kind of differ a little bit, and we'll talk about that. What they say in Lexile.com is that when a student has their Lexile measure, so this particular student has a Lexile measure of 1240. He looks like he's about 2 years old, which makes me laugh. What Lexile.com is saying is that that student should only be reading in what they call their sweet spot. And their sweet spot is 100 below that number to 50 above. And here it tells you all the great books he can read. And over here it tells you all the great books he can't read, like Charlotte's Web and Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. So imagine telling a student, I'm sorry you're such a good reader, but you can't read these great books because you're too good of a reader. That's a conundrum, and we'll talk about that. It's a tool and it's guiding, but that sweet spot is way too narrow in my opinion. So, and we'll talk further about that. But according to Lexile.com, that is what they're recommending. And unfortunately, a lot of parents drive to keep their children in that Lexile range. And I can tell you, having been an elementary school librarian for so long, when you get those students that are reading those high above 1,000 Lexiles, elementary libraries have very few books that are above 1,000. And when they're above 1,000, most often they are informational nonfiction texts, or they're, I don't know, really long books like Redwall, or, you know, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of another one. They're really long, you know, long books that these students do not want to read. So let's talk a little about that range. one of the things to remember is that even though they're saying there's that sweet spot range, every kid is more than just a number. They are a range, I'll give you that. So they're saying 50 above and 50 below. And I'm not a big supporter of that. I think it's way too limiting. And if any of you are familiar with like the Sunshine State books, this becomes problematic in schools that make students stick to this restricted level, because it's not allowing them to read a lot of things that are on their grade level, especially the students that are high Lexile readers. So imagine the students that are trying to read the Sunshine States and their Lexile is, 800, 900, 1,000. And a lot of the Sunshine State for the 3rd through 5th grade level are not that high. And when they're picking Sunshine State, Lexile is definitely something they're keeping in mind. It can be very restrictive. It can be also challenging to the libraries, to the K through, 6th grade or however high this goes, as far as the schools using it. Mostly elementary are using this. If you're telling the kids that they can only read that small little suite range, a lot of collections don't have enough books to support that very focused range. So it's a two-edged sword for sure as a tool, but it could be a little misguided in my opinion when they're trying to narrow the focus so defined. I'm a big person that supports the importance of book choice. So when the students would come in, for me, when I was working in the elementary school, the students, they had their Lexile written on their library card. And what we finally agreed on between talking with administration and the teachers is that in 2nd through 5th grade in the school I was at, they could check out 2 books. One of the books had to be in their Lexile range. But for us, the Lexile range was very different than that 50 and 150. At our school, the Lexile range was, you could go 150 to 200 below, depending. And if you were anywhere around 800, you could go pretty much down to 500 all the way up to as high as you could go. Because what the problem is that you don't want students who are reading at a 600 level, always checking out Dr. Seuss and Redfish, Bluefish, and they'll try, and then they're never going to increase their fluency or their reading ability. So the resolution or the concession we came up with at the school I was at is 2 books they got to check out. One had to be in their Lexile range, but our Lexile range was much wider than that 50 and 150. And the other book was always a book of choice. Because if we pigeonhole children into that range, we're taking out preference, we're taking out reader motivation, we're also not accounting for age and maturity, and I'll show you a little bit about what I mean by that in the next slide. And those students that have those higher Lexiles are almost penalized when you limit them to that very small sweet spot, especially in elementary school, because it's very limiting. There's not a lot of books above 1,000 Lexile. So let's say that Lexile is a good starting point and a guide, but not a rule as far as that sweet spot range is stated on Lexile.com. That's one part where we differ. All right, so last year I had to reread Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, and I have to say as an adult, I had a much deeper and loving appreciation for it than I did when I was in high school and middle school, and Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Those 2 books, one of them has an 890 Lexile and one has a 950 Lexile. And would anybody like to unmic their mic or unmute their mic and tell me which they think is which? Or they can type it in the chat, whichever one.
I would think it's going to surprise everybody, and Diary of a Wimpy Kid's going to be the higher.
And actually it is, oh gosh, you know what? I just blanked, my Lord. Yes, it is. No, actually it's 890. Ray Bradbury's is 951. And actually, you know what? Hold on one second. I'm going to bite my words because I just looked this one up. So we're going to go to, excuse me while I move a Lexile.com. I just looked that one up right before we started, and we're going to go to find a book. You guys can all see this, right? I've shared the right screen, right? Okay, and we're going to
Yes.
type in Fahrenheit 451. And there it is, it's 890. So here, there's an example, Lexile.com, great website. You can search by Lexile range, that was the 890. Sorry, I had a mental break at that moment. I just put that slide in about 10 minutes before we started because I can remember when I worked at the elementary school, when once again, getting back to that Lexile and motivation and choice, the students all wanted to read Diary of a Wimpy Kid. That was it didn't matter what Lexile they were. They all wanted to read it. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna get the chat open here. I've lost that. But they all wanted to read Diary of a Wimpy Kid. And there it is. I read a bit about Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Oops. Oh, sorry guys. See, I start touching chat and I lose everything. Hold on 1 second. I think the 890 is a bit high for that book. So what I think, David, is it is the sentence length and the complexity that's really driving a lot of that up. And one of the things that you could do, you could have a little fun with it. At that Lexile.com website, you have the ability, and I'll show it a little bit farther, is to do a Lexile analyzer. You can cut text out of a book or off of a Word document and paste it into that. And that is a lot of what will drive it up. It's not vocabulary. I do not think to a large extent in any way. I've read several of the Diary of a Wimpy because there's not a lot of high vocabulary, sometimes a bit of a double meaning in some of the text there, because it's kind of, you know, as an adult, I found it kind of funny because I took it differently than the kids did. But I think a lot of it is those longer sentences. It is going to be not the semantic, the word complexity as far as how many times they see a word, but it's going to be the syntactic, the sentence issue, sentence structure that's driving it up. But that was one of my favorite ones because the kids that, and it's a great example also of motivation. At our school, we also had scholastic reading counts where they would read the book and then take the test. The students that had much lower Lexiles than the 890 could read, or 950. I mean, with much lower Lexiles than, I mean, they'd be like in the 400s or 500s, could successfully read the Diary of a Wimpy Kid and pass the test. So that a lot is driven by motivation. And vocabulary didn't necessarily stop them. It was the fear of, due to that sentence structure, that they would lose tracking, that they would lose the memory of what it was saying and things of that nature, but they maintained enough of it. So motivation plays a huge part. Okay, so Harry Potter and the Curious Garden, which is a picture book. The Curious Garden, the picture book, is the 840 and the Harry Potter is the 880. And the Curious Garden is actually an adult guided one, and we'll talk more about that. But it really does come down a lot to the sentence structure and the word choice, not the book length. And there's a great obvious thing, because that picture books tend to be about 28 to 32 pages. And we all know Harry Potter, you know, everywhere from 500 or so, 300 to 500, whatever pages. Definitely not an issue of how long the book is. Just an example there. All right, so when it comes to Lexiles, there's a bunch of codes. It's not just a 500L. A lot of times there's a prefix in front of it, and I'll show you examples of what these prefixes mean. So you got to see in the last slide, this Curious Garden, it was an AD. That's adult directed, and that means better read aloud to a student rather than having the student read independently. A lot of times in books that have a lower Lexile, like around I don't know, 1-200, adult directed is very helpful because there's a lot of conversation going on back and forth between the characters. So tracking is difficult. The NC is nonconformity, good for high ability readers who still need age appropriate content. And with non-conforming text, when you open the book, very often the pages, the text isn't set in like your typical easy read back and forth fashion. It jumps around the page, it continues to the next page, it's cut off, and you're forced to carry your thought. So it doesn't read as smooth and as easy as another book. High-Low, which honestly is one of the most difficult books as a librarian to find, is meant to be engaging for older students, but at a lower reading level. If you can find a good author that does a very good high-low book, it's a unique thing. It's a difficult thing to write. A illustrated guide, an IG, is a nonfiction book which usually has things like insets, arrows pointing at it, glossaries, things of that nature. GN is graphic novel. BR is a beginning reader, and those people that are assigned a beginning reader are going to be about a Lexile of 0. So nothing goes below a 5, so they have to give it a BR, and we'll talk more about BRs in a little bit. And any book that is signed an NP is because it is a poem, it rhymes, it's not standard punctuation, it's poetry that's done in like concrete fashion where it's making a word. It's difficult to Lexile, so it would be assigned an NP with no number. It just means that they don't assign it a number. All right, getting back to BR, because BR can be a very confusing number to deal with. Anybody who is a BR is reading below a 0 as far as Lexile goes. A lot of kindergartners, a lot of 4-year-old students, if you're 4-year-old children would be below a BR. Now, the weird thing with some BRs is that they also have a number after them, like this one, that's BR 150. But a BR 150 is actually a lower level reader than a 0. A BR 200, okay, let me go down to here, I'm sorry. So think of BRs as like the x-axis on a quadrant, an x and y-axis, the x. So 0 would be in the middle and all the positive numbers would be to the right. But when you put a BR on something, it's like a negative number. And BRs would be going to the left with the negative numbers. So a BR 150 is actually a better reader than a BR 400. Even though the 400 is a bigger number, because it's like a negative number and heading off to the left on that x-axis and the negative side, they're actually a worse reader than a BR 150. So at the bottom, so which would indicate a stronger reader? Right off, you would think the higher number is a stronger reader, but it's not. A BR 200 is a better reader than a BR 240. If you think about it as negative numbers, the 200 is closer to the 0, and that's something to keep in mind. That was very confusing when they made that distinction with Lexiles, because at first they didn't have those type of distinctions, and they came on later after some of the Lexiles were established, and it was very confusing to the teachers. Okay, so as far as adult directed, getting back to that AD, a lot of times with an adult guided, the sentences are long and they have high level vocabulary. And it's helpful to have a parent or an educator to help guide the reader through those. Sometimes the adult directed also has to do with the layout on the page. They've changed the font size. It's pictures that may be interrupting the flow of text, things of that nature. Once again, the non-prose are the rhyming ones, and usually if once a book is 50% non-standard is when it will be assigned an NP. So sometimes books can have a few things thrown in there that are poetry and break it up and they'll still have a Lexile. But if it's more than 50% non-conforming, they will give it a non-prose. Non-conforming are great for those students that have high Lexiles, like gifted students that have a high Lexile. A lot of picture books are non-conforming. They don't follow the typical pattern of what would be a reading page or reading skills for students. So even though the words on there are not that difficult, the way the book is set up takes more strength to read. And students that are higher level, like gifted kids, they love the non-conforming ones. And I have an example of that. So let's do some examples of Lexile. Here is a biscuit, a lot of sight words, very little conversation. Matter of fact, there is no conversation in this one. And that is 100 Lexile. Here's our friend Pete the cat. And Pete the cat jumps up to an AD 420. Does anybody want to chime in as to why they think it's an AD adult guided and why it's jumped up to a 420, especially when I see still a lot of sight words? Anybody want to take a guess? You can just unmute your mic if you'd like to.
Because of all the characters talking throughout?
Yes, that is the primary reason. There's a lot of conversation jumping back and forth between Bob and Pete. So it's requiring a lot of tracking of who's talking. And to have an adult or an educator next to you helping that student walk through that between who's saying what, that drives the Lexile up. Absolutely. Here is a Lexile of a 730. And you do see a lot of commas in there. A lot of commas, a lot of long sentences, driving that Lexile up. This is going to be an example of a non-conforming. It's a book called Imaginary Fred. And when I first read this book, I had to reread a couple of pages because the non-conforming part of it threw me and I missed something. This is an example of a non-conforming text. So you can see that the sentence structure is kind of free flow in there. Almost looks like a poem in some sense, but it's not. It stops at the bottom of the first page on the left and jumps to the right page. And if you look on the bottom of the right page, it doesn't even finish the sentence. It's a comma. So it's requiring the student to have a lot of stamina as far as reading through all of this, maintaining it, keeping the memory in mind of what they just read. And I truly am not lying by the fact when I first read this book, because I was trying to find some non-conforming examples, I had to go back and look again because it threw me and it's the way it jumped. So that's an example of a non-conforming one. IG, this is an example of an illustrated guide, and you can tell it is a nonfiction book. We see some labeling, we see insets, we see bolded words. So this is an illustrated guide. It's a 520. And I want to just stop for a moment and talk a little bit about informational texts. Informational texts very often, this is a blast-off reader, and if you aren't familiar with them, they are a great nonfiction series. If you don't have, if you're looking for ebooks, Epic is one of those online free sources that you can get. Epic online for educators and students has a lot of these blast-off readers in them. And the one thing you have to always keep in mind with informational texts, think back to one of the things that drives up Lexile, and that is how often a child will see a word. And how often that word shows up in that analyzing program that Metametrics came up with. The thing with informational texts is that they're being introduced to subject-specific vocabulary. And because it's subject-specific vocabulary, they're not going to be seeing it frequently. And because it's not going to be seen frequently, that reading mode that we're talking about would drop. Back in that chart, it would drop because it has a lot of words where they're not seeing them frequently in typical things that they read. So let's see, I've covered it up with the chat box. Hold on one second. Come on, move chat box, there we go. Oops. Okay. I'm going to master that chat box one of these days. This book has a Lexile of 630. And when you look at it first breath, you know, it doesn't look that difficult. And this was another one of the series that the students love to come in and grab. Very little text on the page when they were forced to read something within their Lexile range. Very little text on the page. but the Lexiles were really high. And it was because of the frequencies of those words showing up. But a great nonfiction introductory series had a lot of great nonfiction vocabulary insets, a lot of the things that you're looking for when you're picking nonfiction. So the thing to keep in mind through all of that is that very often when you're going into the nonfiction section of a library and you're choosing books, the Lexiles are going to look really high, but a student can still successfully read them with a lower Lexile. It's because of the vocabulary that they don't often see is driving that Lexile up. Lexile.com is a phenomenal website, and I have to say, even between when I did this presentation last year to this year, they have updated and added a lot of things. They've spent their time this past few months very successfully in updating things over the last year. But Lexile.com gives you the ability, like I went in and typed in type 451 when I had my mental brain fart and couldn't remember, has a lot of information that you can pull off of. You can search for a title, you can search for an author, you can do it by ISBN. Down here, if I know a Lexile range that I was going to try to aim at, you can type in a Lexile range and it will give you a list of books within that range. It is a great finding tool when you're trying to make sure that you do try to pick a book that's in a student's readability range. One of the other great things about that website, as I was saying to David earlier, there is a Lexile analyzer, and a fun thing to do if any of you ever want to be authors and you've already written some stuff, drop your text into the Lexile analyzer and see what your own writing comes up as. If you're thinking that you're writing a book for second grade and you drop it in and you're coming up with a Lexile of 800, you might have to rethink your sentence length and your vocabulary. It's a great stop and check. If you do pay for the higher version of access to Lexile.com, you have more you can download longer text files and things like that into there. This one's only 175 words, but it will give you an idea of Lexile. So if you get a book that is not Lexile, this is a way to try to get a feel for it. And just to let you know that it takes time for once a book is published to get a Lexile. There's a lag, and before it starts to show up into the databases. So it could be a way to do a check to find out where a book falls before the Lexile is actually published and out in any of these finding tools. And that just tells you a little bit about that sentence structure or the Lexile analyzer and how to pop things in. An alternative mode is like, so let's say you have an author that has written, I don't know, 10 books, and the new book came out, and you would love to know the Lexile of it. It is very common for authors to say, because of their writing styles, to publish books within the same roundabout range. And this is just showing you a few by Carolyn Haywood. And so she tends to write about, that's about 100 range right there. So books within the same series, books by the same authors can be somewhat of an indicator of where a range is, especially if you've had a new one that you don't have a Lexile for. Now, what do you do with these Lexiles in your classroom? Well, they're great for those little reading boxes that they're trying to do for the differentiated learning and for the groups. They help you pick the books that are going to be in that sweet spot that they can go off in the corner and they can do their silent reading and be successful on their own. It's great for that. The other thing is that you can search for text and so if you're doing something using a periodical or any type of text where you want to differentiate what the students are reading on different levels, you can make easier versions of it and harder versions of it so that you can reach everybody in your classroom. And sequencing, so if they start out lower and they get stronger as they go along, you can make that ability to grow with them. And of course, you can always share the Lexile with the parents. The CMC are here, we have started to Lexile our books. So in the picture book collection only, if it has been Lexiled, when you open up the book on the front cover, you'll see a little label. I am working and trying to get the Lexiles also into the catalog. So when you search within our UCF catalog, A lot of libraries in elementary schools put the Lexile on the spine. I am not a fan of that because you will have Lexile envy, Lexile comparison, my Lexile is better than yours, Lexile embarrassment. And I've seen it myself. In my school, I refuse to put any of those indicators on the spine of the book. We put them inside the book, so if a student wanted to look, but not on the spine of the book, because it can be it can embarrass a child, especially in the upper grades, a 5th grade student that's reading at a lower level. We don't want to embarrass them in any ways. And I've seen also Lexiles put onto the library cards. Now, as far as where else you can obtain Lexiles other than Lexile.com, in the education program, I hope you were all familiar with this one, the CLCD, and I'm going to go ahead and click onto that. This particular database, you do need to authenticate through UCF. So if you are no longer a UCF student, you don't get access to this. This is one of the paid databases. But it has a Lexile range down here, so you can actually hunt and peck for books within a specific Lexile range, and I'm just going to hit search. And the cool thing is now, over the past year, anything with a heart are books that we have here at UCF. So these books I know are in the Lexile range. So here's an example of a fun one, drama and Don't Let the Pigeon Drive Bus. Those books are pretty different. Oh my gosh, Bark George, love that book. So Bark George, we don't have because there's no heart, but Don't Let the Pigeon Drive a Bus, if it has a heart, we have it here in this library. So you can do a Lexile search through this database and know that we have the book because of the heart. I'm going to bring up the News ELA just because it's a great place to get specific things that are newsworthy, shorter pieces of reading that can be done in a class on specific subjects. It's kind of like articles. The one caveat is that this used to be entirely free, and it's not entirely free anymore. So I almost hesitated to use it. But the reason I did is because a lot of districts actually buy into this, and they put it in their single server sign-on. So when the students log in, they have access to it, the teachers have access to it. But one of the great assets to it as far as being a teacher is that the teacher can pick a specific article, and then they can have that article delivered in different Lexile ranges. So all the students are getting the same article, all with the same title, but then you can differentiate it according to the readability of the students in your classroom. And then they can all participate in the conversation. So this particular, it's this same article. This is a 560 Lexile, and this is the 1150. So in the end, the students can all talk about the article, feel like they participated, but you can see the difference of the complexity, the difference of the words, commas, conversation versus the 560. Okay, so that was a lot of information to throw at you as far as Lexile goes. It is definitely a tool you want to become familiar with as educators. It is a tool that can be very handy, but also be careful of allowing it to, or be careful of it pigeonholing students into too defined of a range, especially with parents. You almost have to protect your students when it comes to parents getting hold of this information, because what happens is that they think the student should be stuck in that range, and hopefully through explanation and through discussion, you need to, discuss book choice and let them know that it's not the range you want to be in, not that precise. So let's see, any questions for me? I know that was a lot of information, but it's a great tool. All right. Well, I want to thank you for spending your Wednesday afternoon with me, and I do appreciate y'all coming out. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And once again, even if you can't physically make it onto campus, please know that we are here through email and through telephone. And if you don't feel comfortable stepping into the library, you're not and I totally get it, but yet there's books you want from us, we would be happy to accept an email from you telling us what you want. We could pull the books for you, stick them into a bag, check them out to you, and just hand you the bag. So we're very much willing to work with you in any way we can and to keep that connection established and help you through all of these remote learning-ish, remote learning environments that we're going through right now. All right, that's it for me. I appreciate it, Michelle and Carla.
Thank you, Amy Daviditis. If you fill out the Google form in the chat, it will send you a certification of your attendance at today's KnightED talk. In the title, just put Lexile more than just a number.
All right. Thank you all for attending. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.